Are you looking to get ready, be prepared, and transform your financial future? Then you've come to the right place. This is the Get Ready Money podcast with Tony Stewart, where Tony has insightful conversations with financial experts who are changing the way we think about money. Catch up on the latest financial trends and hear practical advice from Tony and his expert guests so you can build healthy habits that work. Be empowered with tips for implementing small changes that can have a big impact on your financial future. So sit back and get ready to hear from today's guest.
Welcome to the Get Ready Money podcast, changing the way we think about money. I'm pleased to be joined today by Rahkim Sabree. Rahkim is a financial empowerment coach and author. In this episode, we'll be discussing Rahkim's thoughts on how we change the way we think about financial trauma. Rahkim, welcome to the Get Ready Money podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, excited to have you on today and to get into it. To get started, tell us a little bit, what is your origin story?
Yeah, my origin story goes back to childhood, probably. I grew up in Mount Vernon in New York. My parents were young parents. And when they separated, probably in my early teens, I became aware of the household finances. And that kind of started to shape my perspective on money, like what was possible for me, what are the things that I wanted to do for myself financially. And those were not necessarily positive things, right? I didn't think home ownership was within scope. I didn't understand how people could afford to buy groceries without food stamps. So I aspired to have those things because that's what I knew. Fast forward to 2011, I started working in the banking industry and had a crash course on bank product services, how to sell those products and services, and certainly how to apply a lot of those things to my own personal finances. And in conversations with customers and colleagues, I started to realize that certain things were possible, right? I could own a home. I could, make enough money to buy groceries and, do all of the things. And so that kind of started a spark for me to get the education that I needed and start applying that education financially. And it's just been a journey ever since. Within the last 2 years or so this is coming off of a 10-year banking career, I discovered the community of financial psychologists and financial therapists focusing on your relationship with money from a mental and emotional perspective. And so, more specifically, I focus on financial trauma through the lens of, those clinical and academic approaches to these topics, but also through the lens of my lived experiences. And so, a lot of the content that I delivered over, the last 4 or 5 years have been very intuitive based off of what my lived experiences were. And now I have the vocabulary, right? The words to describe what was happening internally, psychologically, neurologically rather. And so that has helped kind of solidify my message as certainly being more credible and at the same time relatable to people who might be experiencing the same thing or people who did not know that, people were experiencing these things.
Well, that's great. Yeah, and you're one of the few people that, at least I know, that writes about financial trauma and talks about it. What inspired you to really get specifically into that as your specialty?
Yeah, good question. It's been kind of like the evolution of, right? Like when I first started talking about money, or financial literacy, there was this kind of very generalist approach to having these conversations, right? You talk about budgeting, you talk about saving, building credit, all of the building blocks. But I knew intuitively, based off of my experiences, that, there are people who understand budgeting in theory, at the very least, may even try to establish a budget, but don't make enough money to adhere to that budget. I had built my credit from, going from a place of not understanding credit at all to 830. I think my highest credit score was 832. And so talking about like what that process looked like, but the more I talked about this stuff publicly, and really a lot of those talking points were reiterating points that other people had made. I realized that there was a disconnect between the people who knew what they should be doing and actually doing it. And so I wanted to explore what that disconnect looked like. And at a time, I called it financial empowerment, right? Like, how do we feel more financially empowered to do the things that we know that we should be doing? Um, but then I realized, well, there's an obstacle there that exists. And what is that obstacle? And I didn't have financial trauma necessarily as the vocabulary phrase to use at that particular point in time. But I think the more time I spent in the space, the more I tried to put those things together. And the term that I had come across was generational trauma. And so looking at trauma through the lens of generational trauma, particularly as it impacts Black Americans, I was able to say, okay, well, yeah, there's generational trauma that impacts Black Americans through, A, B, C, D, E lens, right? But what about the financial lens? And so I put the phrase, the words finance and trauma together, and I just thought, okay, like this is a new thing. It's something I created. And then I learned very quickly, there's nothing new under the sun, right? People have been talking about financial trauma for maybe a couple of decades now, but it just wasn't reaching the mainstream in the way that some of these other concepts were. So I doubled down on the term, and it's interesting now, to your point. I think a lot of people are now starting to associate financial trauma with my work because I talk about it so much. But I can't take the credit certainly for the term because it's existed before I even knew what it was. But I think the way that I talk about it is also pretty unique as well, right? And so that's how I got into it. And when I started to see that the audience or the audiences that I would touch would react to this content and the way that they've reacted, either in being able to identify financial trauma in their own lives or being able to identify the role of financial trauma in interactions that they may have had with other people. There is something about that trauma that kind of connects us all, as we all have to kind of interact with money. And so even though I've niched down into a very specific audience and a very specific message, it's kind of become like this universal language that people understand. And that's where I think I really enjoy being one of the subject matter experts on a topic because it comes back to me, right? Like, what is trauma? How do you define trauma? Like, is this trauma? And financial trauma specifically, but I'm starting to even hear people associate the word trauma by itself, absent of the finances, with me and my work. And I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. That's outside of the realm of my expertise, but certainly, I can tie a money example into most instances of trauma that people are experiencing. And so it's rich and fertile ground for me, in that there's not a lot of um competition for people's attention when I talk about these things.
Yeah, well, I think it's so powerful. And I think, one, it is becoming more common to talk about these things. I think generational trauma, as you point out with Black people, is, that it's real. I think there's a lot of people who say, well, it's not real, it doesn't exist. But, you look at it in so many different ways, and statistically with mortgage redlining and all the different things that have occurred over the years, these issues are very real. And I think what you're finding is what I think the financial services industry is discovering overall is that money and finances are interrelated to everything else in our lives. And so when you mention that as people are associating you with trauma in general, is that I think it's because of that, is because, where does the line really end on financial trauma on intergenerational, wealth is like, because is it a social justice issue? Is it because certain cultures and socioeconomic strata have been disadvantaged? So, it's fascinating when you start to parse it down, but I think because you started with something so specific that people can figure out how to apply it rather than a theoretical thing, because you've given them a very solid case example of what it is and how it's impacted people. So I think it's powerful. So, just to get into our next question is, why do you think the financial preparedness is important in your work with financial trauma?
Yeah, I mean, so going back to how I stumbled onto this, right? It was not so much the people who didn't know what to do, but the people who did know what to do, but had the obstacle in actually doing it, right? And so I think like there is this misconception that people who are experiencing poverty just don't know. And I think yes, there's definitely the reality that there are resources and processes and tools and even a reluctance, right, to engage in financial systems based off of that generational trauma that we talked about. But there is just the people that exist that they know what they should be doing and they don't do it. In terms of financial preparedness, though, maybe the issue is a reframe, and I don't want to be insensitive in making the statement because when you think about trauma through the lens of what's happening neurologically, right? When you think about somebody who is experiencing poverty or somebody who is in a survival state, they're not making the most rational decision, right? They're making the decision that helps them survive in that moment. And then you extrapolate that moment out over the course of weeks, months, years, even, and you realize that there's an unnatural state that exists in that trauma, right? In that survival, where it's like your brain doesn't have the ability to distinguish between a perceived threat, right? Or an actual threat that's standing in front of you. And so again, going back to this idea of sensitivity or empathy, financial empathy is a term that's kind of starting to be used with more popularity now. Um People are maybe afraid or maybe don't know what they don't have access to, and in that, that's where the financial preparedness piece comes in, where I could go into a community or you could go into a community and say, okay, I'm going to teach you that more than budgeting, more than saving, more than building credit, how do you go and you leverage these things to change your circumstances? And maybe that just looks like you need to learn how to decrease your expenses, or you need to learn how to shop at places that are going to have, I don't want to use the word cheaper, but less expensive items or food, or maybe there are resources that you could tap into. Not from the perspective, and you talk about social justice, and my mind is like spinning right now. Not from the perspective of dependence, right? We want to encourage independence financially, not the financial independence from the fire movement, but financial independence in that you're not having to rely on subsidies or government programs, but you're able to start to kind of create and build for yourself. And it's really a fascinating world, kind of like when I think about it, because I come from that world, right? Like my mom had food stamps when I was growing up. We had Section 8 to kind of subsidize like what rent looked like. And so I know that that's the reality for a lot of people. And I also know as a part of their own trauma or their lack of preparedness or maybe their limiting beliefs that they don't want to get off of these programs because getting off of these programs then means like, well, how can I survive? So going back to your original question, what is the role of financial preparedness and all of this? Well, it kind of gives you like the blueprint for the game, right? Like, how do you go out and create this plan and leverage these tools so that you can establish independence, without having to be dependent on systems that kind of keep you in that position, if that makes any sense.
No, that makes perfect sense. And where my mind keeps going is you're talking about the stuff as payday lenders. And when you think about the locations of payday lenders, is they're in lower income neighborhoods generally. And that's predatory lending. And those populations are generally underbanked, overall. So it is a cycle where it's hard to break out, and it develops generationally, is because parents use payday lenders rather than banking systems, and they pay those fees. That it's, and it's not that people don't understand, it's just that they don't really have the ability or the time, because they're working day to day, they've got kids to raise, everybody's busy, if you're working two jobs.
Yeah, I'll just add to that too. Like there's a mistrust there, right? So yeah, maybe there's a family that knows that the check cashing or payday lending is predatory and wrong, and it's more damaging to their finances than good, but they don't trust the bank. They don't trust bank products. And so I kind of touched on this in the beginning, but like there's a reluctance to engage on the part of some people in some of these financial systems, or there is the aftermath of some lack of knowledge that makes you unable to, right? So like when you think about this through the banking lens, if there is negative remarks on check systems, which most US banks run to determine whether or not you're capable of opening an account, well, then you can't open an account. Like you don't have the ability to open an account at the bank. So what do you have to do to survive in cashing your check, or whatever? Like might have to go to check cashing, or Walmart, or wherever. And so again, I think a lot of these examples may have started from a place of survival. Like, I just need to do this thing in order to make it to the end of this week. And then that extrapolates out over and over and over again across like months and weeks and years. And then you see that behavior as a child, and then you adopt that behavior, right? And that becomes a norm for you. So I think there's really a two-pronged, I guess, approach to this issue, right? There's the education piece that comes in, like you said, with financial preparedness, but then there's also like overcoming the mistrust that maybe kind of created this phenomenon in the first place.
Yeah, and that gets back to the generational trauma, because that is a generational trauma, that mistrust. So it is all related. So let's get into something tangible. What basic money concept do you wish people knew? What's the one thing you keep coming back to and go, boy, I wish people really just knew and understood this?
Yeah, I like this question because I think most people would say something like budgeting or building credit or saving it. But I think understanding that personal finance is personal, and so it's going to look different for everybody, is the concept that I keep coming back to. And so much of the goals that we adopt for ourselves financially, myself included, come from somebody else's idea of what you should be doing. And so when we get to a place where we can determine what are our goals aligned with our values, right? As individuals, as families, as communities, culturally, etc. Well, my goals and my values might look very different than your goals and your values. That does not have anything to do with the math of budgeting or saving or building credit. That has more to do with, well, what's important to me, like what gives me fulfillment. And then when we go a little bit deeper and we talk about like the money stories or the money scripts, right, that exist in how we interact with money. Like, do we believe that the accumulation or acquisition of money is a bad thing? Do we believe that if we had so much more money that would solve all of our problems? Do we have like this crash diet approach to money that says, well, I'm not going to give myself the allowance to enjoy anything that I've worked for because I just have so much to catch up with? Or does our money represent status for us, right? These money scripts that was coined by Dr. Brad Klontz are things that will also influence our values and certainly our behaviors around money. And so going back to this idea of our goals, like there's financial influencers who jump on these platforms and say, oh, well, you should be saving 30% of your income, or you should be saving, 40% of your income, or, do this, do this, do this. But those pieces of blanket advice don't take into account the variables that I've outlined. And so, where somebody might be struggling financially, and this is the only piece of financial education that they've had exposure to, it can create feelings of guilt, shame, and I think more than anything else, frustration, because it's like, well, I want to be doing this thing, but I got to tithe on whatever the service date for their spiritual practices are, or I have to bail my family out of this emergency, or I want to pay towards education, or I want to help pay for my parents' retirement, or I want to help pay for my child's school. And there's just always like this never-ending list of things that take precedent over doing what's right for you in that moment. And so I think giving people the space and the grace, right, to say, okay, personal finances are personal. And so what your goals are your goals, and what your values are your values. And how do we create a plan that pulls from both of those that makes you feel the most comfortable and the most secure in how you're managing money and what you believe about money? Um, so that I think, yeah, that's the thing, right? People need to understand that personal finance is personal, and certainly more personal than it is financial, and that people need the space to be able to kind of live in, what they create.
Yeah, no, I am with you 100% on that, that's personal and we need to be non-judgmental and respectful of people's cultures. You mentioned spirituality is, different religions may, dictate that people do one thing or another with their money and how they live and their expectations. So it is all down to the person. Um, Habits are also really important. What is one habit that you feel people could change when it comes to their money, or what could they learn?
Yeah, another great question. As you ask me these questions, I think about the version of me that existed before I stumbled into like financial therapy and some of the things that I would say, and the version of me that exists today. And that's why I kind of like just I laugh and smile at these questions, because you would ask me this question 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I would say instantly, pay yourself first, right? Like that's the habit. And I still believe that. I believe, today that the habit that people can change is prioritizing self, right? Starting to take a portion of everything that you earn and putting it aside into something for you, whether that is, building out your emergency fund, or um investing for retirement, or investing, for the sake of investing, like not spending everything that you have, living beneath your means. Um, but again, I think looking at this through the lens of empathy, right? Some people don't make enough money to do that. Like every penny needs to be stretched in order to save, or in order to pay for the bills. And so I think in addition to paying yourself first, I'll also add like the um the addition of more income, right? We have to figure out ways to generate more income that allow for us to have the flexibility to, take on that, random expense, or to save, or to pay down debt, or to invest without feeling, pressured all the way to the top. So what does that look like? You know, developing an income generating skill set, diversifying your income, right? Developing multiple streams of income. We live in now a creator economy, right? Where everybody is trying to monetize everything, right? Every area of expertise, and creating a course, creating a book, creating, a YouTube channel, a subscription service, like everybody's charging. And I don't think that there's necessarily something wrong with that. Certainly I participate. But I think also like to some degree in where we are today, it's necessary, right? Like maybe the amount of money that you make isn't enough to cover everything. So you need to have some kind of money coming in that can go towards you, whatever that looks like. Even if that's just self-care.
Yeah, no, I'm with you 100%. I think self-care is really important. And I'm also glad that you point out income because, there's not enough focus on that sometimes. It's like, everybody focuses on expenses, doing this, doing that, telling people what to do instead of asking them, what do you want to achieve? And then helping them figure out how to achieve that. And if that requires more income, then that might be the solution. Um, for people to say, hey, maybe I do need to pick up something on Saturdays, work a Saturday shift somewhere, or drive Uber, or whatever it is, or, create content, something else to bring in that income so that they can take care of paying what they have to pay. Because if you are living paycheck to paycheck, you don't have the luxury of creating a 6-month emergency fund straight out of the gate. It sounds great, but you can't set up your emergency fund. You can't contribute the max to a 401k and, all the other things that are recommended because, it requires balance and no judgment for people, and hey, we all don't do what we need to do. That happens. We're human. So that's awesome. So, to wrap up is what is your number one tip on changing the way we think about money?
Um, I have to kind of echo that whole idea around empathy, right? And so a lot of times when we talk about financial empathy, I mean, it's the newer topic, so a lot of people are not talking about financial empathy. But when I talk about financial empathy, usually with organizations, I'm talking about how can you be empathetic to your customers, your clients, maybe even your colleagues. But I think turning that empathy inward is equally important. And so how do you demonstrate empathy to yourself financially? What does that look like, right? Giving yourself grace in that, maybe this month you didn't meet your budgeting goal, or maybe you had to carry a balance on a credit card, or, a lot of the behaviors that are usually associated with shaming in the personal finance space sometimes just are things that we need to do to get over this moment. And so I think very similar to when you're dieting or when you're exercising, right? When you have that cheat day or when you miss a workout and then that one missed workout turns into two, turns into three, and the next thing you know, you haven't been to the gym for a week or 4 weeks, right? It's this idea of getting back on the horse, and not just kind of like giving up on your goals. And so I think when we think about empathy of self, that that piece is important, right? Even if you deviate from your goal or from your plan, it's not over. It's just a matter of getting up and starting it all over again. And so I talk about this concept of financial resilience, and striving for financial resilience over financial perfection, because financial perfection is it's not real, right? It's a snapshot, right? I talk about having an 830 credit score at one particular point in time. Like, yeah, I could screenshot that and like, oh yeah, like I have 830 credit score. But the more that I engage with credit, the more fluctuation is going to occur. Or even if I don't engage with credit, right? Like, if I froze everything, there would still be fluctuation. And so I think the resilience piece is understanding like with these kind of ebbs and flows of maybe our investment accounts, our savings accounts, what our income looks like, what our credit score looks like anything that touches our kind of financial world, that the deviations occur, and accounting for that and being kind to ourselves in the process is necessary.
Yeah, no, I'm with you 100%. And I always think of dieting as very similar to budgeting. because it's that same psychological thing, and it's what you've been talking about. Everybody knows what they need to do, but it's how to do it. That's the thing, and how to stick with it is, because that's the thing. You get frustrated, you give up on your diet because it's not sustainable. You put on the weight again, and boom, there you are having to do it again, and it's harder, as you say, is to get back and do it again. Because it's so easy to get beat down. So, Rahkim, I really appreciate your time and your insights. Where can people learn more about you? Where can they subscribe to your Substack newsletter, which is awesome?
Thank you. Substack is rahkimsabree.substack.com. I have a weekly newsletter. It's called Overcoming Financial Trauma. It goes out on Friday mornings, most Friday mornings at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Standard. Sometimes I'm an hour or so late. I also contribute to Forbes now. So I generally do a weekly new post, but that kind of varies. My website is rahkimsabree.com, and all of my socials are at Rahkim Sabree. So I am probably wherever you are, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, wherever. And that's the best way to reach me. My social media is in my website.
Awesome. And for everybody tuning in, like always, I have links in the show notes to all the different ways to get in touch and follow Rahkim. So thanks again for coming on the Get Ready Money podcast.
Yes, it was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and thank you everyone for tuning in. Please remember to subscribe to the Get Ready Money podcast. Until next time.